we're assuming that you want to collaborate and that you've gotten together with this person and you've vetted them and you got this idea. Well, collaborations in many ways it's a long-term commitment to that person. So just as if I wouldn't marry somebody that I met in Vegas at a Elvis Chapel, I wouldn't jump into a co-author relationship without really thinking about it, right? And we don't think about it that way, though. We just think about the book and we think about the collaboration, and we don't necessarily think about the next 50 years and beyond.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indie Author Podcast, I talk with Michael La Ronn about best practices to collaborate and create, including the intricacies of collaborative writing, the importance of having clear contracts to avoid misunderstandings, the challenge of finding collaborative writing tools, the value of leveraging each collaborator's strengths, assigning tasks based on expertise, and navigating the logistical challenges of promotional activities. And now, let's hear from Michael La Ronn about best practices to collaborate and create. Hello, and welcome to the Indie Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Michael La Ronn. Hey, Michael, how are you doing?
Hey, Matty. Great to be here as always.
Yes, you are a many-time return guest. And so I think that our listeners have heard your bio probably so many times they don't need to hear it anymore. But I thought instead it would be fun to find out some fact about you that we wouldn't learn from your bio and might not otherwise know.
Okay, so I had to really think about this one. So a lot of people probably know that I wear the same type of shirt, generally speaking, although I'm not wearing it today, but I generally wear the same type of shirt every day. It's usually a button-down Oxford. And I do that because I don't want to have to think about wardrobe. I got other things that I want to spend my brain power on. But another thing about me is that when I go into something, I go hard. So like when I want to learn how to publish, I'll just publish as many books as possible. Like I take stairs 2 at a time. And I think I was talking to somebody once and they said that says a lot about your personality, how you climb stairs. Oh. So like I physically cannot go up a staircase without doing it 2 at a time. Even if it's like a staircase where I know I'm literally going to fall and break my neck if I get this wrong, I have to go 2 at a time. So I don't know what that says about my personality. I'm a risk taker, I guess. I like to live on the edge of, I don't know, genius and insanity. I don't know which one I am, but I love to live on that edge. So that's the fun fact maybe about me. So on the outside, I've got Oxfords, but on the inside, I'm rolling the dice everywhere I go.
Yeah, I was saying to someone that if I find something I like pretty soon all my clothes are going to be free versions of something. Like if I find a shirt, like anybody who watches this on YouTube knows, I wear exactly the same shirt in all my indie author videos, and I have like 6 of them. So pretty soon all my wardrobe will be things that are in sets of 3 because why not? If you like it, might as well get more of them.
Yeah. When I find something I like, I buy it in every color.
Yes,
and
exactly.
I'm shameless about it. I own and the Oxford I own, it's the same brand, same everything's, but different color, different patterns.
Maybe you can get like a spokesperson deal out of that. Become a spokesperson.
It would be nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if JCPenney's listening, just please help a brother out. Hook me up.
Oh, dear. Well, I like that fact. I guess that's something we could have known if we paid enough attention, but now you're throwing us off because you're unaccustomedly wearing something different.
Yeah, I am, because I was doing a workout today and you caught me at a time where I'm not wearing it. But every day, generally, I'm usually wearing one.
You're such a rebel.
Yep.
So with that, there must be a good transition that will come to be in a moment, but I wanted to invite you to the podcast, back to the podcast, because we've been doing a lot of podcast appearances for our book, From Page to Platform, How to Succeed as an Author Speaker. And it seems as if in almost all of them, we end up venturing away from the speaker topic and into the co-authoring topic. And we learned a lot about co-authoring while we were writing the book, some of which we're capturing in possibly another book. And so we're going to be talking about co-authoring today and just talking through some of the experiences we had, the things that we think are valuable to share with other people. And I think that probably if anybody's been listening to either the indie author podcast or other podcasts that we've been on, they know the story that we were in New York City for a Writer's Digest conference. We went out to dinner. We were chatting about the whole experience of landing that gig. And that was where the idea of From Page to Platform was born. We both said like, oh, we have enough here to write a book about being an author speaker. And so now that we've established where the idea came from, I want to talk a little bit about one of the earliest parts of co-authoring a project, and that is the agreements. Some more formalized in the form of contract and some less formalized just in terms of an informal agreement that the co-authors have. So, Michael, I know you speak very eloquently on this topic. Can you just talk from your perspective about why it's important to have an agreement on those kinds of things more or less formally?
Yeah. So we're assuming that everybody knows that you want to collaborate and that you've gotten together with this person and you've kind of vetted them and you kind of got this idea. Well, collaborations in many ways it's a long-term commitment to that person. So just as if I wouldn't marry somebody that I met in Vegas, quick at a Elvis Chapel, I wouldn't jump into a co-author relationship without really thinking about it, right? And we don't think about it that way, though. We just think about the book and we think about the collaboration, and we don't necessarily think about the next 50 years and beyond. Is that as an author, the bedrock of our careers today is that we own our copyrights for our lives plus 70 years. And when you think about that as an exceedingly long time. And so you want to be thinking about that when you are working with a co-author. And the best way to make sure that everybody is on the same page is to have a written contract. Because it's funny how time goes by, people's memories change, people change. And so the contract keeps everybody honest and protects you both and the book and the readers who would want to buy that book and who would benefit from it from the contract disputes and the sort of things that come up.
Yeah, I think that the contract can both keep people honest, but also keep them unconfused, because I know that our collaboration extended over quite a long period of time. And so we might have an agreement about like the platforms we were going to distribute the book on. And then 3 months later, I think, what did we agree on? And it was nice to be able to go back to a document we both signed and say, oh yeah, I remember that now. And so just having that as a reference, I think, is very important. I'm a big believer in the idea that if you're signing a contract with someone, it doesn't mean that you don't trust them. It means that you do trust them enough to actually embark on a project with them. And so I think that can help people get over that, like, oh, it feels icky to ask somebody to sign something to formalize our agreements.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I don't want to sound cynical when I say it keeps people honest, and I agree with you, Matty. I agree 100%. But there's also, just because I've been in so many situations where things have gone south where I didn't think they were going to go south. You also have to remember that you're looking out for yourself and your own career as well, right? And that's not a selfish thing to say, that it doesn't make you a bad person, but you want to protect both of yourselves. And the best way to do that is just to make sure you're on the same page. And then once you get all the paperwork and stuff out the way, then have a good time, have fun, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, people do think that it's a scary thing, or you're coming across badly by making someone sign a contract or even suggesting it. And that's not what I'm trying to suggest. I just think that you have to be realistic about what you want from your career, what the other person might want, and the fact that people commonly misunderstand each other. And the way you mitigate that is with a contract.
Well, the other thing that you called out that I thought was very valuable when we were working on this is that one of the things we called out is, in the case something happens to one of us, then who is the person who steps into the role? And so it was our spouses in both cases. And what is the spouse supposed to do if now they're faced with a situation where they've inherited the proceeds from this joint project and they don't know what's going on unless there's something there that they can look at and say, oh yeah, I see what the agreement was. And then that person hasn't necessarily established a relationship with the other collaborator. And so it's just a nice insurance policy should that situation arise.
Yeah, you've got to think about spouses as well, right? So if something, how hip is your spouse to what you're doing every day?
Right.
Do they know everything you're doing and they're a co-owner in the business and they're with you every step of the way? Or do they have no idea what you do every day? And the situation is going to be different for each co-author. And the way you address that is going to be different based on the situations for that author. And so it's just something to think about. And again, I know it's not something people like to hear. It's not a sexy thing. A lot of people don't like to think about their own mortality. But thinking about that, I argue, is actually an act of compassion because you are thinking about what's going to happen and looking out for your spouse or your significant other, or whoever your beneficiary is, enough to try to make their lives a little bit easier after you're gone. So think about it like that, not so much as a burden or a barrier.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other thing that was important is that we sort of divided the agreement we came to into the more and less formal aspects of it. So we had a contract that we actually signed that had things like, how are we going to divide the royalties and what falls into the parameters of what we're dividing up and which doesn't, and who would be our next of kin, or what the right term is. Those things that have very definite factual things that we could sign up for, like how are we going to distribute the book? And we're going to talk a little bit later about how we maybe thought it was going to be different than it ended up being. But there were those things that seemed factual. And then there were things like, we kind of want the table of contents to look like this. We kind of want the scope of the book to be like this. And so then we had a separate document that we were still capturing these things, but it was more fluid and it was less formal, that said, let's still have one place we can all look for this information, but it's not the kind of thing you can really sign your name to before a project starts. Were there any other examples that you can think of things that were definitely things that you want to pin down in a formalized contract, and then the kinds of things that are helpful to capture in a less formalized contract or less formalized agreement?
Yeah, so some things that I think are important are who has the final say, right? So probably what's going to happen 9 out of 10 times, 99% of the time possibly, is you're both going to be on the same page about what you want on the cover and the book description and all that. But in that rare event that you can't agree, who has the decision-making power, right? So it should be one author, and that person has the final say. And that will stop you in the rare event that you come to a loggerhead and you just can't decide what you want to do on the editing or where the story's going to go or what goes on the cover, you name it. There should be that one person that has that final decision-making power. And I think that is another important element that the contract should have. Yeah.
That makes sense. So that was just a very high-level view of how we came to the agreement about working on From Page to Platform. I also wanted to talk a little bit about how we coordinated things. So let's talk a little bit about the writing, which I think we've said this before. Actually finding a tool to get this book written was probably the most challenging part of this. And we tried all sorts of things, including a shared Word document, which was sort of not very practical. And I think what worked well, like looking forward for any next collaboration we might have, I think the idea of having each person sort of independently generate the rough fodder, like I'm moving toward this metaphor of digging the clay out of the sand so that you can sculpt it into the book. And that part that's digging the clay out of the sand, I think people can do independently, as long as it's all funneling into one person who can kind of stick it together in a rough format. And it keeps there from having to be that shared document dilemma early in the process. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think for people's benefit, it probably would be good to cover how we like our process before we go into that, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So we started off at what did we start off in Google Docs? I think is what
I think so.
We started off like passing some ideas back and forth.
Yeah.
Because you've collaborated in the past with other authors, and so have I. Mm-hmm. And so we both kind of brought our knowledge of that past collaboration to this. And Google Docs is just, I don't know, there's just something about Google Docs that just doesn't work for me.
Yeah.
I think it's visually, there's something about it that just doesn't feel like I'm working on a finished product. I don't know why that is, just personally, but
it feels very uncreative somehow.
Yeah, which ironically, it's designed to be creative and collaborative, but just visually, it just doesn't do that.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Maybe if Google's listening, they need to figure that out. So then we switched to Microsoft Word and we were trading Word docs back and forth. And well, actually, what we tried to do is we tried to use the OneDrive functionality to where you would be in the document and I would stay out of it. And then I would be in the document and then you would stay out of it. And that failed after maybe the first month or so. And then we ended up trading Word docs back and forth, which ironically, that's what I was doing 10 years ago when I was collaborating with an author that I work with on a fiction series.
Yeah.
So things really haven't changed all that much. And that's kind of unfortunate. And yeah, I guess that was the process we followed. But I agree with what you said, that creating the fodder, having one person run point on the project, doing a rough draft, so to speak, and then passing that along and then letting the next author take a pass at the next draft. That's probably a better way to do it. But I think every book is going to be a little different, right? Because it works for you and I because we both kind of know what we're going to say about this. Like I could easily write the first draft just as much as you could easily write the first draft. I think if the balance of knowledge was different, like if maybe you knew more about the topic than I did, maybe that wouldn't work and you would have to find a different way to do it. But I think most people are going to be on the same page.
Yeah, I think that when you're deciding how to divvy things up, there are going to be areas where, like we have a section on travel and travel insurance, and obviously you're the best person to write that. We had a section on doing author readings. That's something that you don't do so much, but I've done more of. And so sometimes there were chunks where like, I'm just going to take this, you just take this. And then as you're saying, there were other parts that were very interconnected. And I do think, although we didn't really do this the first time around, but in the next go around, I think that idea of collecting chunks of information and having someone assemble it can circumvent the situation where somebody's writing something, like working on one chapter and decides to include a piece of information. Somebody else is working on another chapter and happens to include the same kind of information. And then it's harder to extract it then and straighten it out. So I'm a big believer now. Of course, this varies from collaboration to collaboration, but I'm a big believer in having somebody do the assembly early on and then move to passing it back and forth when it becomes more of a joint activity.
Yeah, agree.
I'll just say to wrap up that conversation that we had this model of passing control of an airplane, that there's the standard of one pilot saying, I have the plane, the other pilot saying, you have the plane, and then the first pilot saying, I have the plane, to make sure everybody's clear about who's controlling the plane. And we were very explicit about that and even used that terminology, like, now you have the manuscript, I have the manuscript. So that was helpful. And also used the free version of Trello for some of our coordination. Kind of a combination of Google Docs, spreadsheets, and Trello, I think, were the two major areas where we did coordination.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. That's something we should probably hit a little more. Like, you were really organized with Trello. I'd used it a couple of times, but I'd never really used it that much. I'm kind of a fly by the seat of my pants kind of guy. So you using Trello and helping us stay organized in the tasks, I think was really helpful. And I think people listening, you probably should find some sort of organization task or app that both of you agree to use that helps you stay organized in terms of timelines and who's on first, all of that. Because I think that really helped us. And it also helps, like for me, like I can go back to that. Like if there's any links, like where do I find the book files? Or where's the promotional materials that we put together? Like it becomes a brain for the project that both of you can refer to after you're done.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the idea of using Trello as that central source that links to all the other things. And I do think that although Google Docs was, we both agreed, not very inspirational for actually producing content. I find it very useful for maintaining lists of like podcasts we want to pitch or something like that.
Oh, for sure.
And to me, the real power of a spreadsheet format over something like Trello, although I recognize you can do it in both, is if it's something you're going to do over and over again, like a book launch plan, you don't want to have to come up with a book launch plan every time you launch a joint book. And so were we to do another book together, then we would have that book launch plan all ready to go. And we even divided up like, here's a task, here are the notes that are generic across any book launch, and here are the notes related to this particular book launch. So then it's super easy to not have to recreate that. And I think that's another great plus for sort of thinking of a collaboration as being like a creative marriage, because if you can do an activity within that collaboration more than once, then it becomes more and more efficient with each time you do it.
Yeah. It's like your own solo publishing endeavors.
Yeah.
Once you publish your first book, it's never harder than that. It becomes infinitely easier because you know what the processes are. You kind of know where your pain points are. And so it's a very similar process when you're collaborating.
Yeah. I think that one other thing I wanted to mention about the creation of the content, and especially when we got to the point of editing, is that there are those things that you were saying earlier, you need to designate the one person who has the final authority. And because I was publishing this through my imprint, in our case, I was the person who was designated as the person with final authority. I don't know that we ever had to rely on that, because at some point, you're just going to disagree about things. And there are ways of addressing it other than making a big deal of it. And I know at one point, you felt strongly about travel insurance. I didn't feel strongly one way or the other about travel insurance. I can see pros and cons, but it's something that we wanted to cover in the book, as a speaker would be traveling a lot to go to in-person events, and this would be an important thing to know about. And so we just specified, Michael is someone who works in this industry, has thoughts to share. And so I felt comfortable that I wasn't recommending to people to do something that I myself didn't necessarily do. And we were being completely upfront about that, and it was not problematic. What are your thoughts about when you get to that point where you're negotiating like the individual pieces of information in a nonfiction work?
Yeah, I think it's ultimately about compromise, right? Like if it were up to me, that travel insurance section probably would have been a lot longer than it ended up being in the book. But we talked about it, and we definitely shortened it down, and it was fine. It was a collaborative thing, right? And so I think that there's going to be those elements. There are going to be those things where each author wants to bring certain elements to the table because that's what makes them who they are, right? And so understanding what that is, and also understanding that what you bring to the table is going to be perceived differently by that other author. And there's value in talking about, hey, should we actually include this? Or if we do, should we include it a different way? I think it helps eliminate blind spots, and it's a good development opportunity for both parties to be able to do that. I always go back to what you learned on Sesame Street. You got to learn how to share, and you got to learn how to communicate and all that. And sometimes we forget that as authors because we have solo careers, and all we do is sit in a room by ourselves and make stuff up. And we get really good at it. And when other people want to move our cheese or they want to get involved in it, we get defensive. But in reality, you're collaborating to have fun, and you're collaborating to create something that is bigger than what the two of you could come together on. And so you're going to have those conversations, and it's productive. It's productive as long as you keep moving things forward.
Yeah. And I think in the specific case of nonfiction, which is what we were writing, it's not necessary for each person to totally agree about each topic, as long as the philosophy is sort of common. So I think maybe like the benefits of doing author readings as an author speaker. I think we had different experiences and different perspectives on that. It doesn't mean that we can't include a section on author readings and each of us say, Matty does or doesn't do this, and here are the reasons. Michael does or doesn't do this, and here are the reasons. And it's not a thing. It's actually adding more value because we're presenting two different perspectives on the topic. And so I'm sure that in some circumstance, there could be this is the hill I'm going to die on sort of scenario, but I think that would be very rare.
Yeah. it's not, it's usually not necessary. I mean, if you have too many hills you want to die on, then I would argue maybe you didn't get into the right collaboration agreement, right? Because typically when you pick a partner to collaborate with, you've got to be on the same wavelength.
Yeah.
And you've got to, I mean, you don't necessarily have to see the world the same way. I mean, Matty, you and I have very different philosophies, but we have enough in common that we kind of know where we're going to take the book. And I would argue that if you've got too many hills you want to die on, you might not have picked the right collaborative partner.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that understanding a couple of foundational concepts, like the idea of professionalism is everything, is something that I think we both profess to believe in and demonstrated we believed in, and we're in agreement about. And so if you have that common foundation, then it doesn't really matter if you differ on the details of how you execute on that. I think that we both agree on the foundational concept that it's not that certain goals for speaking career are good and certain goals for speaking career are bad. It's just that the actions you take depending on your goals are different. And you and I specified at the beginning of the book that our goals for each of our author careers as speakers were different. And I think that's valuable because then that's going to appeal to different readers. A wider swath of readers is going to say for one of us or the other, oh yeah, that set of goals makes sense to me.
Yeah, we share a similar philosophy in terms of how we show up. And our goals are different, but the philosophy it's enough in common that it makes us a good fit.
Yeah.
Right. And if my philosophy for speaking was get as much money as possible and yours was professionalism, we probably wouldn't be collaborating, right? So we have similar enough worldviews. And I think that's important. And having that conversation kind of goes back to the contract. Having that conversation about that philosophy in the beginning before you sign a contract, I think is also helpful.
Yeah. There's another person that I would love to do a collaboration with, and I haven't quite talked her into it yet. But we're having conversations about the topic that I would like to write about. And those conversations are going to be valuable, I hope, to both of us, regardless of whether this ever becomes a collaboration or not. Neither of us are in a big rush to do it. Like, I just don't have the bandwidth at the moment. And she's still a little bit on the fence about whether it would be interesting for her or not. But if months go by and eventually we both come to an agreement about it, or we don't come to an agreement about it, that will still have been valuable conversations that we would have had. But then we'll go into it saying, with both of us being able to say either, oh yeah, this really isn't meant to work out, or oh yeah, this really is meant to work out.
Yeah, that's great. And that kind of points to another thing about a trial period is maybe you can start working together or exploring and give yourself 90 days or however long you want to give yourself and just see if it works. Like, are you compatible? The 90-day money back guarantee, right?
Yeah.
And if it doesn't quite work out, then you both can take what you have, scrap it, and walk away.
Yeah, and you could do a similar kind of thing by deciding you were going to co-author an article, for example.
Right.
An article
work on a
that
smaller project.
Work on a smaller project, maybe an article that would become a chapter in the book, should it go that way. And just like getting a sample edit, I think that's a great idea to try it out with a smaller project and see if things are feeling good to you or not feeling good to you.
Yeah, I agree. And this is especially true if the interactions you've had with the person are only virtual.
Yes.
So we live in a world today where if I wanted to, I could very easily go and find a co-author for fiction.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I could just go on Facebook and say, hey, I want to co-author a book. And I guarantee you I'd get a bunch of people that DM me or message me. But that's not necessarily the right way to do it.
Yeah.
So being able to do a trial period to see if you work well with somebody, I think is a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that was very interesting to me is that when we first went into this, I believe that the agreement was that we would do all our distribution through Draft2Digital. The reason we had picked that is Draft2Digital has a very nice royalty splitting option. And so that would completely take off the requirement of the administrative work of splitting royalties. I guess even at the beginning, we recognized that Google Play was going to fall outside of that because Drafty Digital does not distribute to Google Play, but for all the other platforms, including Amazon, we were going to take the hit on our royalty percentage in order to buy the convenience of having that all taken care of. But there were two things that ended up making us rethink that. One is that it turned out that you couldn't put up pre-orders on Amazon through Drafty Digital, I believe, was one of the considerations. But the other more annoying consideration was that when I entered all the information into Drafty Digital and I was selecting pricing parameters that would allow me to pick the 70% rather than the 35% royalties. And then that went over to Amazon. And unfortunately, for one of the non-US markets, the parameters that Drafty Digital has designated for 35% versus 70% royalties and the parameters that Amazon has designated for that are different. So for one of the non-US markets, what worked at Drafty Digital did not work in Amazon. And fortunately, it didn't work so much that they just completely kicked that record out. I never got any notice or anything. It was just like the launch day came and there was nothing on Amazon. And so finally, after some research, we realized this was the problem, and we ended up deciding to go direct to Amazon to avoid that issue, which I think if we were doing another collaboration, I would recommend doing that as well for those reasons, but also because I just think that there are levers you can pull on Amazon if you're distributing directly to them that you can't get if you're distributing through an aggregator.
Yeah. And it just depends on when people listen to this, right? Because Amazon is so situational. If you listen to this on the day we record it, everything you said is probably true. But who knows? 5 years from now, maybe it'll be a lot easier to collaborate. Maybe Amazon will introduce a royalty splitting tool of their own. Who knows, right? So it's so situational, and I think you just have to look at the distribution landscape. But I think you should be prepared that you're going to have to do some manual level of royalty splitting, whatever that might be. And so that begs the question of, okay, well, what is the royalty split and who does the splitting? Because it has to be one person. So whoever, and that person could be the same as the decision maker, or it could be the other person, who knows? But you wanted to probably specify that in the contract as well. So who's going to split the royalties? How are they going to pay the other author? How frequently? Right? And these are just conversations that you can have on a quick phone call and then just put it in the contract and you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was one of those things that we had a little addendum to the contract, because when we originally thought we were going to be going everywhere except Google Play through Drafty Digital, then it kind of made sense. I can't remember exactly, that twice a year or something like that, I would send you your Google Play half of the royalties. But then once we realized that the Amazon royalties would have to be paid manually as well, then it made sense to relook at that and say, well, if we're making loads of money on the book and a lot of that's coming from Amazon, you probably don't want to wait 6 months to get your portion of that. Let's relook at the frequency and make that more frequent and adjust that over time as needed.
Yeah. And then the other thing, just because I can't help myself, you also have to think about long term. So 20 years from now, what happens if the person who's responsible for splitting the royalties can no longer do it? For whatever reason, either death or incapacitation, or maybe they just don't want to do it anymore. How are you going to do it then? So that's a conversation you need to have in terms of, what if the other person was not available or not around tomorrow? How do you take control of the book at another retailer? So one of the things that, Matty, you and I put in our contract was that if one of us becomes incapacitated, right, the other person shall have the right to manage the book on other retailers. So because you manage the book, something happened to you, it's in our contract that I can take over the book. So I can send that to the retailer, and that helps considerably with my conversation with them to say, hey, I own the copyright to this book. I'll take it over. And then it's my responsibility to divide the royalties. So it was your responsibility first, and then it becomes mine. Okay. So that's just something to think about, because again, it's easy to think about today, but you also got to think about tomorrow, and tomorrow meaning 10, 20 years, even greater down the road.
Yeah. And I think that another consideration is how big does the book become? And so this is something that I think would be very hard to really nail down specifically ahead of time. But what's realistic to manage in terms of manual royalty splitting is different if you're making $100 a month from a book or you're making $10,000 a month from the book. Mm-hmm. And so I think there always has to be that outlet saying, hey, look, this is, for whatever reason, this is not workable anymore. And so we need to return to the contract and relook at something that makes more sense for everybody. Of course, if you could do that ahead of time and say, in these circumstances, then the rules will change. Yeah. But I think that would just be very difficult to do, to have that kind of crystal ball.
Yeah, and just remember that your contract is not etched in a stone tablet. You can always update it. As long as both parties agree. You could come up with an addendum that says that we agreed to do this before, but now we're going to do it this way. So there's nothing that stops you from coming back together again down the road.
Yeah.
And updating.
Yeah. So I wanted to switch to marketing and promotion. So the book is coming out, about to come out, or preparing for the launch, what have you. And I think a lot of the marketing and promotion we sort of did individually. So as an example, we had an earlier conversation on the podcast about being an author speaker. I had made little clips of that I was putting up on social media. There wasn't so much coordination on that front. On the promotion front, I guess. On the marketing front, some of that, in the sense of like a website being related to marketing, that was somewhat separate. So I'd say in general, that felt more separate to me than some of the earlier processes. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it was. That's the other benefit of collaboration, is that both people bring their own platforms to the project. So my email marketing is going to look different than your email marketing, right? And how I engage my audience is going to look different than your audience. Now, we're going to develop a new audience as a result of the project as well, but that's a different animal. For most people, I think, listening to this and who are collaborating for nonfiction, I think they're just bringing their respective audiences to the book, right? And so it is very much a solo effort, but I do think it's important to figure out which way the dogs are going to move. You know, you want your dogs pulling in the same direction. So are you going to be promoting the book around the same time? How are you going to be promoting the book? Like Matty, you're way more on social media than I am, right? But I have a YouTube channel. And so there are things I can do on my YouTube channel and on the various places where I have community. So just make sure your dogs are pulling in the same direction, and I think it's fine.
Yeah. And I think that's one that it's more important to just keep the other person apprised of what you're doing, because if I had made a bunch of clips from a conversation and you had made a bunch of clips from a conversation, it's not very efficient. Right. If you know I'm doing that, then it relieves you of the responsibility to do that. And if I know you're doing YouTube videos about it, then it relieves me of the responsibility to do that. And the other thing I thought was interesting is the idea of doing promotional appearances. So, like, of course, if you're promoting a book about being an author speaker, you have to speak about it. You have to become an author speaker. So it was interesting to negotiate if an opportunity came up, I don't think either one of us thought it was ever necessary for both of us to participate. Now, we did get to do a couple of interviews where we both participated, and that was very fun. But I think each of us has also had the opportunity to speak on the topic, and we're not necessarily trying to coordinate that with the other person. What are your thoughts about having things be joint or having things be individual in those cases?
Yeah, we've had some opportunities come along where we've both done interviews, but then there's been some times where maybe you weren't available, Matty, and so I jump in and do a talk. And you've done some talks on your own as well about this. And I think you have to come to the same page, figure out what you want to do. Maybe you both do want to appear jointly. Maybe it's good for both of you to do that. Maybe you both have good chemistry that you can do that. Maybe one person just wants to be in the shadows, and there's one person that takes the lead in doing all the interviews. So just talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, the downside of joint stuff is the logistics. And so just
schedules
just the difficulty of going through there's nothing that annoys me more than going through the, well, Monday works for me. Does it work for you? No, but Tuesday would work for me. Well, Tuesday afternoon would work for me, but that just makes me crazy.
Yeah.
So I think to me, the joint appearances are great. It's like the most fun, but I don't want to necessarily have to go through the whole coordinative thing every time an opportunity comes up. And obviously, if it's more like presenting a webinar or doing a presentation at a conference rather than a podcast interview, for example, then that exacerbates the difficulties of doing that jointly.
Yeah. There's the scheduling, but then there's also just the logistics of being on the same call, right? So Matty, you and I have had to figure this out when we're doing joint interviews. Who takes the questions?
Yeah.
All right. And we've kind of had to spin it a little bit to the hosts and say, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Host, please assign us a question.
Yeah.
Don't just say the question, because then Matty and I have to figure out, we stare at each other awkwardly and figure out who's going to answer this.
And then I start to speak and then you speak.
Yeah, we're too polite. You just gotta assign a question to us and then we can go at it. But that's another thing you have to consider. And also the host too. If there's more than one host on the podcast, then it just becomes a nightmare. Because if it's one host, that's one thing, because that's just 3 calendars. But then you got 4 or 5 calendars you got to manage. It's not worth It's not worth it, and it just becomes easier for it to be a solo.
Yeah, one thing that has worked well for me, I know that this wasn't necessarily an idea that you were super enthusiastic about, but if you're on Zoom, if you're on a platform where you can see whether the person is muted or unmuted, in other circumstances, especially when I, as a podcast host, have been interviewing multiple guests, which I do very rarely for these very logistical issues, I say, let's everybody mute. And then if you have something you want to say, if I pose the question, if you unmute, that will be like a subtle way of raising your hand, and I'll know that you're interested in answering it. And so that's worked well for me as a host. I did discover platforms that for some reason you can't see whether anyone's muted or not. So you have to know ahead of time that the platform will enable you to see that or not.
Or you kind of have to do the whole awkward raise your hand if you want. You want to, and that just doesn't look good if you're doing a video. Yeah. So it's a delicate balance, but these are, I would argue if you're having these conversations, it's a good thing. Like you're having this conversation about how you want to collaborate, like that's productive. That's going to help you get to where you ultimately want to go, as opposed to just showing up for an interview and it being a bomb, or the host gets frustrated because you guys can't communicate.
Right? And probably another approach is that we each brought particular expertise to different topics. And so if a host threw out a question about doing author readings, I think we would both agree that I was probably going to be the person to answer that. If somebody threw out a question related to estate planning, I think we would both know that you were probably going to take a crack at that one, and then opening it up to the other person to add anything that they'd want to add. But the more people involved in the conversation, the trickier it gets.
A lot of cooks in the kitchen.
A lot of cooks
in the kitchen. A lot of people bumping into each other. But, it's just, that's how it goes. And it's fun. It's part of the fun.
Yes, it is part of the fun. And I guess the last thing I wanted to hit about marketing and promotion was the idea of developing the sales description for the retail platforms. And I forget who, one of us drafted that. We sent it back and forth. And that turned out to be pretty different, I think, in the end than whoever did the first draft of it, just because that was one where we were bringing pretty different perspectives to it. And I think the combined result of both our attentions was better.
Yeah. I argue that it's better to have one person that runs point on drafting it, and then you can trade it back and forth. And just expect that you're probably going to trade it back and forth more times than you want to. And that's okay. I think that's part of the process. Like I have a very specific way of writing book descriptions that is different than yours, Matty. And I think we probably went through 2 or 3 different drafts of the book description starting from scratch. And at the end of the day, we got to where we needed to be.
Yep.
And I think that description is slightly different than what I would do if it were my own book, and probably a little bit different than what you would do if it was yours. But the fact that we came together on it is good. So one person should run point just on that, and also with the cover as well. One person should run point and either design it or work with the designer. Like with my first collaboration with our cover, what we did is I was the person that ran point on it. So we talked about what we wanted on the cover, but then I prepared the brief and I engaged the designer, and the designer worked with me. So that way she only had one point of contact, and the two of us had to get our stuff together and come to an agreement before we responded.
Yeah, I think that's very important. Whenever you're working with anyone else, whether that's the cover designer or somebody that you're working to schedule a podcast interview with or whatever, make sure they only have to work with one person. And I think that in a way, the cover design was somewhat easier than it would have been if we were just starting from a blank slate, because once we had agreed that we would be publishing it under my imprint, I already had sort of a standard for my nonfiction, which was sort of a blue-green tone with a subtle nautical suggestion. And the professional cover designer I had gotten to do my first nonfiction book had already established the font and the spacing and what would be on the spine and things like that. And so when we were working on From Page to Platform, I was able to take all those components and basically reproduce them in Canva. And really all we had to do was figure out the image that we wanted to use, which ended up being we went through lots and lots of microphone images.
It took us a long time to find the right image for that. I cannot believe how long it took us to find that. Yeah. So those are the things you got to talk about. What do you want on your cover? How do you want it to look? What does the branding look like? Colors.
Yeah.
All that fun stuff.
Yeah. So just to wrap up, I'm curious, as you're looking back and we've sort of like refreshed our memories about what the experience was like, what are a couple of lessons learned? Like, what is something that you thought went really well that you would want to make sure occurred again in a collaboration that we might do? And what's something that you'd want to change in a new collaboration?
Yeah. I mean, I think you and I have a good chemistry. Like things were really smooth, right? So like my last co-author, things were smooth too, but they were smooth in a different kind of way. I think our chemistry worked, and we were able to troubleshoot problems that came up pretty gracefully. I don't think there was any huge problem that was like not surmountable. I think the hardest part was just the fact that we drafted so much of the book independently. And I said something that you said, or I would repeat myself and didn't know I repeated myself. And I think that got a little tedious. Yeah. So I think in the next collaboration, gosh, I'd like to find something that would be easier to draft. That would be nice, but I don't know if that tool's out there. I mean, other than that, I think we had a pretty smooth experience. Yeah. What do you think? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that this idea that we're using for the co-authoring book, where we're sort of taking turns digging up the clay, as I had referred to before, and it's more almost earlier in the process. It's more like you have the plane, now I have the plane, is going to avoid a lot of that. I also think a really important thing we did that, I mean, we came to with From Page to Platform, but it took a little longer, is just understanding the scope. And so we talked about wanting to write a book about co-authoring. And then as I was collecting my clay, I was saying, there's the fiction stuff and there's the nonfiction stuff, and there's a certain amount of overlap, but there's a lot that's really different. And it started feeling awkward. Like I would start drafting a section on a particular topic, and I'd have to be saying, for fiction, you'd want to do this. For nonfiction, you'd want to do this. And it was starting to feel very awkward. And also, I have some fiction co-authoring experience, but not very much. I've only co-authored one short story, and I didn't feel like I could expand that to offering people advice about writing longer works. And so I think we saved ourselves a lot of trouble pretty early in the process of saying, let's just make this focused on nonfiction. And I think that will help us both in the drafting of it, but even in the promotion and the marketing and positioning and all those things.
Yeah, they're very much two different topics. I think it would be very difficult to write fiction without an outline collaboratively. I'm intrigued by the idea. I think it would be fun to just see what sort of train wreck would happen if like Like I started a novel and wrote like 2 chapters and then passed it on to the next person and they wrote 2 chapters.
Well, Michael, maybe you and I are going to have to write that book where we're just passing the fiction book back and forth and each of us is writing a chapter and see what the train wreck looks like.
I think that would be a fun train wreck. I mean, I don't know that I would want to be in a train wreck, but if I were to be in a train wreck, it would be that one. Just to see what happened, you know?
We'll have to cue that up so that as a follow-on to our nonfiction co-authoring book, we'll be able to do one on fiction.
Exactly.
The train wreck approach to co-authoring fiction.
Yes. Yes. From infinite pain comes infinite enjoyment for the readers, right? Deal.
So, Michael, always lovely to speak with you. And please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
Well, it's always a pleasure to stop by, Matty. And if you're interested in checking out my fiction, you can find me at michaellaronn.com. And if you're interested in checking out the books I have for writers and the writing stuff I do, you can find me at authorlevelup.com. That's author, level up, all spelled out, .com.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Matty.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Michael. What do you think is the most important factor for a successful co-authoring partnership? Chemistry between the authors? Detailed planning? Something completely different? I would love to hear your thoughts. Just leave a comment on YouTube. If anyone is interested in hearing more about co-authoring fiction, please check out episode 261, Navigating Collaborative Storytelling with Todd Fonestak. And if you got value from the episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.